Do you know where you are, Winston?
I don't know. I can guess. In the Ministry of Love.
Do you know how long you've been here?
No. Weeks. Months.
Do you know why you're here? Shall I tell you why we brought you here? To cure you. To make you sane.
Yes.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. The leading secretaries of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation have manufactured their own way of conducting a so-called Krishna movement. Their standards for guru and disciple are all concocted. The make-show is becoming subject to cynicism and ridicule, and deservedly so. At the same time, they remain the guardians of a psychological prison house controlled by many factors, including the tyranny of conformity. They purportedly represent a reality of a sweeping nature, allegedly the absolute truth, but they are peddlers of false promises. If their way becomes accepted internationally, their cult promises to deliver a harmony of devotional brotherhood and world peace. Have the way things have played out in the last 40 years been indicative of any such future paradise? In a letter to a senior temple president in May of 1976, Srila Prabhupada warned about it. Quote, "Don't manufacture ideas. What is standard, you must follow. Don't make it a farce." Unquote. ISKCON, pseudo-totalism, and its promises have been nothing more but bluffs. It is a disguised version of their particular brand of tyranny. Ecclesiastic tyranny is the worst plague to have cursed humanity since the advent of Kali Yuga. As pointed out last month, so-called ISKCON has its own version or conception of truth. But it is a so-called absolute truth of its own creation. It denies, by implementation of its system, along with its tyranny of thought, much scriptural evidence related to what is bona fide guru and genuine initiation. In the late 70s, it implemented a concoction that overrode an essential order given by His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, namely, regular guru, that's all. This attitude of defiance by the covert leftists of the ISKCON Sahaja cult underlies almost all of its other deviations. In effect, it denies the conception of a real controller, because the governing body of the cult took that power unto itself in 1978. In so-called ISKCON, covert leftism and false promises have thus replaced genuine Vaishnav theism. The absolute truth has thus been hijacked by audacious men who utilize the perverted reflection of absolute power for their own corrupt and selfish purposes.
I have a question.
Bhakti Ernest.
Since there is absolute truth, and since by both definition and Vedic Shastra it must be present everywhere, how could so-called ISKCON function if he did not claim that it represents that absolute truth? How could it function if he did not preach that everyone is meant to come to ISKCON, and that it is the only way to spiritual life, the only way to become linked to and liberated in the Absolute?
That it must make such a claim is a given. There are many cults throughout the world that make such a claim. Some of the fanatical ISKCON acolytes go so far as to promote their cult as the only way. That mentality now has a new handle, the ISKCON line. Yet, there is nothing really new here. Although many groups or institutions or even wildcard gurus may make this kind of claim, their influence can be overcome if you are sincere and serious in spiritual life. The chief reason why you can overcome such a psychic oppression is that through higher intelligence, which along with detachment automatically develops if you are sincere and serious, you can readily spot that their claims have no actual basis. However, Prabhupada's original movement, his branch of Lord Chaitanya's movement, had that actual basis or substance. It is called the Sampradaya. In other words, if you studied his presentation, Prabhupada's presentation, his philosophy, his preaching, his personal conduct, his power, and everything about him, you soon discovered that there was certainly substance from time immemorial connected to everything he represented. There were no contradictions, but in all the other groups or with the wild cards, contradictions were and remain readily apparent. The fabricated so-called ISKCON cult has parlayed all that Prabhupada represented by twisting and perverting it. This makes it comparatively harder to overcome ISKCON pseudo-totalism in comparison to any of the other cults claiming to represent the Absolute. Those devoted personalists who live according to the absolute truth of Krishna consciousness, and especially those who preach it, can be considered totalists. This is an arcane term for absolutism that became popular in America in the 50s. Anyone devoted to the absolute can be considered a totalist, but its only real representative is one who is 100% in sync with the teachings of the Guru Parampara. When deviation from that line takes place, genuine totalism is no longer present. That is what can and does degrade over time into dreadful totalitarianism. The fabricated so-called ISKCON confederation is a once-removed deviation from the Sampradaya. It's off the rails, but it does have an international spread of influence. If everything breaks right for it, it may be able to unite its disparate factions, and then it could turn out to become very dangerous indeed. As long as so-called ISKCON is not thoroughly exposed and its influence checked by strong preaching with higher intelligence, it will continue to claim that it represents the Guru Parampara and get away with it. It will thus eventually morph into something more dreadful than what it is now. It will continue to function no matter what. But over time, if it is effectively opposed now, it will function in the future with very little power. It will dwindle and shrivel, and the fact that it is bogus will become in due course common knowledge. That is wanted.
Vasu Gopal has a question.
Vasu Gopal.
You mentioned in the opening that so-called ISKCON represents a tyranny of conformity. Could you explain that in a bit more detail? Doesn't there have to be some conformity in any genuine Krishna organization or institution?
It's a good question, but people do not conform blindly to roles and rules of conformity. They conform due to identification. They identify with the conceptions or misconceptions embedded within their cult. They identify with the leaders or misleaders of their institution. Identification with the school or sampradaya means the end of that school or sampradaya. We have discussed this earlier in one of our recent articles. That tyranny of conformity spreads and locks in, not because those conforming to it lack intelligence or even ethics, but because they believe that the cult and its leaders are always right. In other words, they conform because they believe in what the cult projects and what its leaders represent and push. They are true believers, and their conformity proves that they are true believers. Disciple means discipline, and discipline entails obedience. The followers and party men of so-called ISKCON will participate in any act, even unethical acts, and they will do so enthusiastically when they are placed in roles that require such acts to be performed. This is especially the case when they are instructed by their leaders to engage in that way, because that's the way things have always been done. There are many misconceptions underlying such conformity, and mistaken knowledge is chief amongst them. The ordinary ISKCON devotee does not really think for himself or herself, because that would result in a bit of a predicament. They do what they are told and become agents of the so-called ISKCON and its process, which is held together in no small part by institutional conformity of thought and action. Conformity to such a deviation eventually results in tyranny of thought. Even if the destructive nature of deviant acts in the name of Krishna consciousness becomes recognized, there are many buffers running throughout so-called ISKCON that shield its acolytes in breaking free from the tyranny of thought. Relatively few emotion-based devotees, particularly newcomers post-1977, have the resources within themselves to resist the cult's strong and powerful authorities. Thus they conform, and that constitutes cheap gurus and cheap disciples. The glue is the tyranny of conformity that so-called ISKCON has psychologically regimented and implemented over many decades. It was also functioning to a significant degree even before Prabhupada departed. Now, conformity in terms of the standard morning program is a routine conducive to ultimate liberation. However, if you are honest within yourself, you will recognize that despite the outward show, the morning program has also been fundamentally changed over the years in so-called ISKCON. How that is so and the specifics of why it is so is an in-depth topic in and of itself, and we could dedicate a full video to that alone. We shall not do so here. The issue is tyranny of thought through tyranny of conformity. In order to function in so-called ISKCON, there are so many misconceptions that a person there must accept. Indeed, he has to accept those even to stay in good standing in the cult. Our written and video presentations expose many or even most of these, usually in very specific details. We do not buckle to the tyranny of conformity that pervades so-called ISKCON, and neither should you. Krishna consciousness is the perfection of totalism. Indeed, ultimately, there is no such thing as totalism if it does not culminate in genuine Krishna consciousness. This entails logic and argument buttressing shastric evidence and injunction. As Prabhupada wrote to Bhaktivedanta near the end of 1973, quote, Krishna consciousness is perfect, so it can be substantiated by all means of argument and logic, unquote. In other words, the potential for pseudo-Krishna totalitarianism will be completely destroyed when totalism in the true Vedic sense of the term, is recognized by enough people and devotees that it replaces today's momentum toward tyranny. Prabhupada brought us that perfection of totalism, and his devotees are dedicated to replacing all forms of totalitarianism, especially the totalitarianism which now reigns throughout ISKCON, replacing it with the absolute truth of perfect Krishna consciousness. Logic is integral to this fight against totalitarian darkness. Remember, so-called ISKCON cannot be bona fide and bogus at the same time. It cannot have the attribute of legitimacy in its formulation and formation if these were and remain underpinned by that which was not authorized by His divine grace. Such has been and remains the case today, and it is incumbent upon all of us to realize that rather painful truth. It is time to confront the illogical and unethical foundation of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation and expose and thus completely reject its power node, the vitiated GBC.
Gokulananda has a question.
Gokulananda.
You mentioned in the opening that ISKCON utilizes a disguised form of tyranny. Is it difficult to discern that tyranny at this time? The cult appears to be disintegrating and not gaining any traction whatsoever in the body political at large. Should we really be at all concerned about some kind of ISKCON totalitarianism?
Well, in the short term, the view expressed in your questions is certainly valid, but your host speaker is not very concerned about the short term. Well, even in the intermediate term, your view is probably valid. That is why we should go full bore at this time to expose that deviation for what it is, and, God willing, terminate its ability to influence and triumph in the future. I am particularly concerned about its influence in America, because Prabhupada started his movement in this country, and America leads the world in most of the important categories. So-called ISKCON has gained very little power in America since Prabhupada departed, and with the current administration, it has no possibility to gain any traction whatsoever. So in the short term, things are not looking all that bad. However, I am not concerned about that. Instead, I am much more concerned about the mega narrative, and that is more than a bit foreboding. Look what so-called Christianity accomplished in 500 years after the departure of Jesus Christos. It took over all of Western Europe for a millennium and one half. That is a long story, obviously, but no one would have predicted such an outcome in the first couple of centuries after Jesus Christos was allegedly crucified. Indeed, the Christians of that era were held in utter contempt, ridiculed, and executed for entertainment in Roman arenas. Yet the cult persevered in its own way. In its later heyday, it appeared to represent its founder, although that would be going more than a bridge too far. Applied to so-called ISKCON, this same danger looms in the mega-narrative. That is because both Jesus Christos and Srila Prabhupada were bona fide. They were self-realized devotees of the Supreme Lord. Prabhupada was and remains superior to the former pure devotee, however, because Prabhupada was not only fully God-realized, but he was also the pure representative in an unbroken devotional line that stretches back to the creation of the universe. Jesus Christos started his own school, but Prabhupada, on the other hand, founded a branch of the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya. Tatvamasi. What you must be able to see here is that when lines deviate, which is most certainly the case when it comes to the fabricated so-called ISKCON church, the deviations still have an afterglow power that to some extent feeds off the bona fides of what can only be nominally called its founder. That certainly went down with Christianity and the totalitarianism of that cult, particularly during its hellish Gothic era of almost complete political and pseudo-spiritual control, is undeniable. All hell is again going to break loose in the West, probably within our lifetimes. When it does, the current political paradigms will be primed for complete breakdown and a huge shift will result. A huge shift. So-called ISKCON, if it is not thoroughly exposed now for what it actually is, will almost certainly be in a strong position to exploit that radical change. The decadence of the West cannot continue unabated. So-called ISKCON is still in its first 50 years since the founder disappeared. And it is not at all being persecuted as was the early church in Roman times. We must develop the long view. And if we do, we will starkly realize just how dangerous the current deviant cult actually is in the mega-narrative. We must not come to this enlightenment too late, for now is the time to expose, check, and squash the thing. If we fail to do so, a couple of generations up the road will look back and condemn us for not having acted before the ISKCON brand of tyranny took over. If Western civilization accepts so-called ISKCON as its religion of choice, that new religion will be far more powerful than what emerged in Gothic times. Why didn't you protect us when you were in a position to do so? This will be that generation's question while laboring under the yoke of ISKCON totalitarianism. I agree with your assessment that the cult at this time is becoming unhinged. That's pretty obvious. So therefore, this is the opportunity to crush its influence. We must act now. Almost a decade before he arrived in New York City, Prabhupada was distributing his Back to Godhead magazine. In Volume 3 of the March 1956 issue, he stated, quote, "We have to defeat tyranny in the realm of thought and create a will for world peace." Unquote. You must understand that ecclesiastic tyrannies are not maintained by fortune, ability, and they're not maintained even by talent. They are sustained primarily by their own concocted tradition. They are easier to defend than tyrannies of a civic nature, since the subjects under their oligarchical tyranny do not resent ecclesiastical bondage. Even when deviated and completely unprecedented, the ecclesiastic arrangement is believed to have been established by the Supreme Lord and upheld and maintained by him.
Bhakta Joseph has a question.
Bhakta Joseph.
What are the tyrannies that ISKCON now pushes? You've already mentioned two of them, and one of those is repeated in the quote from Prabhupada that you have just read. You have said previously that tyranny and totalitarianism are joined at the hip. Can you please expand upon that?
The ISKCON tyrannies comprise a perfect storm. There are three of them, and they work hand in glove to augment each other and expand each other's influence. Those three tyrannies are: 1, the tyranny of thought; 2, the tyranny of conformity; and 3, the tyranny of the majority. You have to be able to overcome all three of these individually. Then you must move up to the next octave and overcome their cumulative influence, which is palpable and in limited circles, overwhelmingly powerful. Your host speaker has today already discussed the tyranny of thought and the tyranny of conformity. Actually, however, the central tyranny is the tyranny of the majority. If you are a man or woman of knowledge, by now you have come to realize that so-called ISKCON is itself a splinter group. However, since it is the initial splinter group, all the other splinter groups have issued from it. They are thus secondary deviations, and this certainly includes both Neomud and Ritvik. So-called ISKCON still has a lot going for it compared to all the other downline splinter groups. It has far more international influence than any of the others. It controls most of Prabhupada's original temples, the temples established before he departed, and as such, it controls virtually all the original deities in those temples. Such installation ceremonies were actuated while he was physically present. So those deities, if he sanctioned the ceremony, which in one case he didn't, but it went on anyway, if he sanctioned the ceremony, those deities must be considered installed. The other splinter groups at most have gained control of only 2 of those deities and centers, so so-called ISKCON is in the position to make the claim that the Supreme Lord recognizes and approves it by virtue of its majority control of temples and deities. Try to understand this. It's not so difficult, especially since you should know by now that the whole movement was hijacked by the vitiating governing body and its 11 zonal acharyas back in 1978. Nobody, and that also means no group, was in any position to contest its control of all those temples, deities, and preaching centers back in the late 70s after Prabhupada departed. All such efforts, if they had been made, which they weren't, would have been easily beaten back at the corporate level in any Western or Indian court of justice, and no such effort was made until well into the 80s. The fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, particularly in the form of its temple presidents, governing body, and institutional gurus, was in an extremely formidable position to be the majority representative of, superficially speaking here, Prabhupada's legacy. That they continue to be so is not even slightly surprising, and unfortunately, such will remain the case for many years. This constitutes tyranny of the majority. They seldom, if ever, make these arguments outright or in print. But the hovering pressure of that fanaticism is ever present when contacting representatives of the group, particularly if you happen to be so unfortunate as to argue with the fanatics. This perfect storm of three powerful tyrannies is in the blossoming stage now. If those three tyrannies remain unchecked, if they are not defanged now, they are the seeds of eventual ecclesiastical tyranny, which will marry itself to a particular form of totalitarianism, which will obviously include a philosophical component somewhat comparable to Marxist-Leninism. However, that witch's brew will be much more formidable than communism ever was. The perfect storm of today is an ecclesiastical fever swamp. It is joined at the hip with formulating fix-it-as-you-go totalitarianism in the budding stage. Now, it takes some intelligence to understand this, and that intelligence is now being provided to you. This whole topic can be expanded upon to a considerable extent in future presentations, and in due course your host speaker will probably do that. These components are present in most organized religions, of course. As far as the fabricated so-called ISKCON confederation is concerned, its oligarchical tyranny is subtly imposed as a war against deliberation. Or, as one of my godbrothers once observed back in the day, a no-think cult. You're called overintelligence. And I have been called overintelligent many times. If you ponder doubtful aspects of so-called ISKCON and its practice, its hierarchy, its management, and especially its history. And this becomes so. You are called overintelligent, especially if you do not accept the institutional pabulum that it dishes out in order to allegedly explain its inconsistencies, what to speak of its bald-faced lies. It has its own way of doing things, and how it interprets its history is part of that. Yeah, but the past is a problem, because the developing tyranny of today, first imposed by the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats in the late 70s, still continues in a different form for a variety of reasons. A few of those pretenders are still in good standing, and they're still allowed to initiate. All of the institutional gurus of today and the interim are still connected to the chain of that 1978 bogus succession. It began with the zonal acharyas, and that is a big problem. It is one which is not to be deliberated upon by the tyranny of thought, which permeates so-called ISKCON. Its brain police admonish all, don't criticize. Of course, it is conveniently forgotten that critical thinking was integral to the spread of the Hare Krishna movement in its early days when things were bona fide. Fine analysis in activity with good memory means discrimination, which has gotten a bad reputation since the 60s for little reason other than to protect the dark-skinned race for preferential treatment. So-called ISKCON does the same thing, but for a different purpose. Tyranny of thought will matriculate into totalitarianism once the chance for it to do so is presented by material destiny, a very bad fate waiting in the wings simply for the right time in the future. As far as so-called ISKCON is concerned, however, today's communication has expanded exponentially, especially in the last few decades. And the internet has thrown a monkey wrench into its plan. Oh, it's nice. It means if you are determined to find out its flaws that are big, consequential, and foreboding, you are now able to do so. And those revelations are interrupting what should otherwise be its linear development toward totalitarianism. But rust never sleeps. Communication that we have today won't last. Communication will be greatly restricted, as it is now in many authoritarian and totalitarian countries. If the ISKCON quasi-Brahminicals are able to worm their way into a position of power behind the throne, honest devotees can now interrupt and check that momentum. We should do so at this time. ISKCON leaders obviously prefer to preach to the choir within their own echo chamber, wherein they have more or less complete control. They are past masters at the power of diversion, as they are fully in the service of the universal regulatrix. How could it be otherwise? Most of them are well aware of the really contentious issues that will never go away, but they cover and divert and steer all of that into their own contrived crises. In that way, they absorb the mass consciousness of their flock. The root issues are entirely ignored by this tactic. Those root issues are conveniently forgotten and replaced by the institutional controversy of the moment. Each of those controversies is considered integral to the institution's very survival, although in point of fact it is merely a diversion and is no threat whatsoever to their scam. On the contrary, it serves a very effective and covert purpose by making itself a banner issue. It is incumbent upon us all to learn the difference between time, place, and circumstance adjustments, temporary arrangements for difficult situations as well as for devotees new to Bhakti Yoga and Vaishnava teachings. 2. Learn the difference as opposed to deviation from the philosophy. Prabhupada made some adjustments, granted, as well as some experiments. For example, the Governing Body Commission was an experiment that failed. However, he did not change the Vaishnava standard in any way, and he certainly did not meddle with the philosophy. Deviation means change, and ultimately that change is rooted in a diabolical mentality. That mindset is able to be passed off today in postmodern so-called civilization as the real thing, due to a general state of confusion worldwide. Many Westerners, virtually the totality of them, are very bewildered as to what constitutes spiritual life and devotional life, both of which must be based on Vedic and Vaishnava Shastra. The philosophical standard is strict, and even a slight deviation from it and from what is explained and purported by the real Acharya can and will create havoc. This havoc is what we are experiencing after what has gone down in the name of the Hare Krishna movement over the last 40 years. There are also the more deviant Buddhist, Jain, and atheist existential philosophies with theories of voidism, nihilism, and materialism. They all deny the spiritual integrity of the soul and as such are conducive to the breakdown of any civilization leading to anarchy, followed by martial law, and then culminating in tyranny. As a spiritual counterfeit posing itself as a Krishna movement, so-called ISKCON certainly destroys spiritual integrity for the unfortunates now hypnotized by it. It does so more effectively than any other deviant school in the world. All authenticity formerly in it has been compromised by the Western adventure in the name of time, place, and circumstances adjustments, and the absolute truth has thus now been squeezed out of it. As mentioned previously, the real thing was hijacked in March of 1978. Those who today benefit from its perverted reflection may appear to be totalists in their outlook, but in reality, they are nothing more than insipid totalitarians in the making. Their Upasampradaya has now been culturally co-opted by an anachronistic Western cum Hindu dumbed-down imposition, which is socially irrelevant, incorrect in its doctrine, and spiritually dead. These deviations from the order of the real Acharya are integral to the universal Jada, and none of its human representatives or adherents is anywhere close to being free from contaminated consciousness. The deviated schools, along with Neomut, simply embellish the general confusion now present in human society. They utilize, somewhat indirectly, a contemporary means for carrying out their missions, changing whatever suits them at any time, often by creating new doctrines and new laws. This has today forged a situation wherein any hope for the world at large to be guided by actual Vaishnava teachings is now scattered and lost. So-called ISKCON and Ritvik are creating havoc, and they have quite successfully bewildered many thousands of newcomers to devotional life. These unfortunates now face the prospect of losing their initial interest in Krishna consciousness and thus becoming hypnotized zombies. Conducive to a reformation of world civilization, if it had been kept pure, the Vedanta philosophy and process mercifully bestowed upon us by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada is now jeopardized. If this continues unchecked, it will culminate in due course of time in ecclesiastic international totalitarianism. This may take place within our lifetimes or it may not, but know it for a fact that it will culminate in that, and that will augur an unprecedented totalitarianism, a perverted reflection of what was otherwise meant to be Lord Chaitanya's great benediction to the world. Genuine Vaishnava totalism is meant to assist in the establishment of an international government that would curtail the absurdity and pandemonium that now runs amok throughout this lonely outpost called Earth. Genuine Vaishnavism can only be present where there are genuine gurus and their properly initiated disciples. This is a very important point. Let me repeat it. Genuine Vaishnavism can only be present where there are genuine gurus and their properly initiated disciples. Genuine gurus. This has never been the case in so-called ISKCON, although the pretension of it is certainly brandished. Only the bona fide guru transmits proper initiation, and that is never transmitted by an institution. The idea that it is, in such circles, indicative that initiation is taken very cheaply there. Cheap gurus, cheap disciples. As stated by Prabhupada in a letter to one of his initiated disciples in March of 1974, initiation must be according to Vaishnava Parampara standards. Quote, "This initiation should be taken very seriously, and those who accept it have to prove exemplary, or it will become a farce." Unquote. The initiating guru must be a pure devotee of the Lord. The validity of any real bhakti initiation is not the property of the priesthood or its institution, and that validity can never be independent of the character of the advanced devotee or otherwise performing the initiation ceremony. Initiation's validity is based upon whether or not the guru is genuine. It is not determined by a governing body, by a society, by an institution, or the clerical expediency of ecclesiastics. A true Krishna cult does not function like the mundane institution, wherein decisions made by its office holders are independent of their ethics and character. Moral and ethical character, advancement of knowledge, and purity in Krishna consciousness determines the authority and effectiveness of any initiation. If the institution is itself entangled in anartha, all of its sanctioned gurus are similarly contaminated. None of them can be empowered to pass on the bhakti lata bij to a disciple. If the institutional guru is entangled in his institution's anartha, which by definition he is, then his initiation is both improper and invalid. The institutional corruption endemic to all ISKCON initiating gurus since late 1977 invalidates all of those fire ceremonies. Such performances may have been colorful and glitzy to the uneducated eye, but there was no spiritual sequence conducted in any of them. And back to the point we began with, that the world is not totalitarian now is quite obvious. So if there's some real will, we still have an environment that allows us to propagate the Krishna consciousness movement as it is and as you as pure spirit soul like it. Interest in the truth is not yet dead. Not for all people anyway. Many individually reach a stage where they want to put the pieces of the puzzle together for themselves. This is laudable. In the process, they realize that they do not have to settle for compromise in anything, because the absolute always remains what it is. ISKCON compromises, on the other hand, are plentiful and permeate their teachings and processes all over the place. That kind of compromise is not the teaching of Lord Chaitanya. It is not the teaching of his perfect representatives in the parampara. It is not the perfect teaching in the branch formulated and formed by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. It is not the teaching of Vedic and Vaishnava totalism. No progressive transcendentalist should settle for any of it. If we do not compromise what His Divine Grace actually and clearly wanted, then we must follow through and not compromise with any unauthorized manifestation functioning in His name. Numbers mean nothing. Such institutions dishonor Him. The best way to staunch the slide of civilization into anarchy and depravity, eventually followed by atrocity-riddled totalitarianism, is to clean up and unite Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness. Now, Lord Chaitanya's genuine Krishna consciousness movement is going to prevail. Be rest assured of that. That is not the issue. The issue is what goes down before it prevails. The issue is whether you are foolish enough to think that so-called ISKCON is predestined to usher in Lord Chaitanya's movement. Most definitely it is not. If you continue to remain hypnotized by its lies and lie along with those lies, then you will be implicated in the hell it could produce. All of this is clearly stated by Prabhupada in a letter to one of his leading secretaries in November of 1970. The quote is as follows: Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has forecast that this Hare Krishna movement will be heard in every nook and cranny of the globe. He is God, so it will happen. That is a fact. So if we take advantage, then we may take the credit. But if we do not, someone else will. Sadeva Samya